The Roman Empire was the epitome of power, a beacon of civilization in the ancient world. From the majestic columns of the Senate to the awe-inspiring gladiator arenas, every stone in Rome's infrastructure seemed to echo the grandeur of its people. Rome had created a civilization like no other, spanning continents, amassing treasures from every corner of the world, and boasting a military unmatched in its strength and discipline. For centuries, Rome's legions marched victoriously, its emperors celebrated as gods among men, and the citizens of the empire reveled in the luxury afforded by their empire's vast wealth. The streets of Rome gleamed with marble, their market stalls overflowed with exotic goods, silk from China, spices from India, ivory from Africa, each of these treasures testifying to the empire's boundless reach. The Colosseum roared with the thunderous applause of its audience. The magnificent baths provided relaxation for the elite, and intellectuals of the empire gathered in forums to debate philosophy, law, and science. However, beneath the glittering surface of power and success lay the creeping rot that would one day bring the empire to its knees. Rome's leaders had become enthralled by their own magnificence. Every imperial palace was a testament to wealth, a symbol of their perceived invulnerability. But as emperors, senators, and generals basked in their luxury, the empire's foundations were silently crumbling, like a great mansion built on unstable soil. Corruption had wormed its way into every corner of Roman society. Political power was no longer a responsibility to the people but a game of manipulation, bribery, and patronage. The ruling class, ever focused on securing their own fortunes, turned a blind eye to the needs of the empire's people. Bureaucracy became a labyrinth of inefficiency, where officials, once proud servants of the empire, sold their loyalty for gold. In the imperial court, the Senate, a once esteemed body, was reduced to little more than a puppet show, with the emperor pulling all the strings. This unchecked greed came at the cost of the common Roman citizen. The very ones who built the empire, the laborers, soldiers, and farmers, found their wealth slowly siphoned off, as taxes grew ever higher to fund the luxurious lifestyles of Rome's elite. The empire's wealth was drained by lavish public games, extravagant palaces, and an insatiable military machine that demanded constant expansion. Rome's wealth was no longer enough to sustain its grandeur. Meanwhile, the soldiers, the very backbone of Roman power, were treated as mere pawns in the ever-expanding game of empire. Their loyalty, once unquestioned, began to fray. The legions, which once marched in unison for the glory of Rome, now found themselves scattered across distant frontiers, fighting for reasons that no longer made sense. As Rome's borders expanded, so too did the burden of defending them. And while generals grew rich with spoils of war, the soldiers returned to barracks where their pay was often delayed or reduced. The loyalty that once bound them to their cause was slowly replaced by disillusionment, and the honor of fighting for Rome began to fade into memory. Rome's glory was built on the backs of men who had given their loyalty, their lives, and their sweat to its cause, but now they were being left behind, forgotten in the rush for more power, more wealth, and more conquest. But this decay was not just financial or military, it was also moral. The very ideals that had once made Rome a beacon to the world, the values of discipline, duty, and sacrifice, began to erode. The empire's obsession with wealth, entertainment, and pleasure replaced its commitment to civic duty. The grand ideals that once underpinned Roman greatness gave way to self-interest and decadence. Rome's aristocrats indulged in luxury and hedonism, hosting feasts that stretched into the night, while the common people, struggling to make ends meet, were given bread and circuses to distract them from the true crises mounting in their world. In these final years of apparent greatness, Rome became a house divided, with its leaders squabbling over power while the empire was being steadily consumed by corruption and rot. And the worst part? No one seemed to see the storm approaching. Everyone, from the lowest plebeian to the emperor himself, was convinced that Rome's brilliance would last forever. They believed they were invincible, that the empire was destined for eternal glory. But all along, Rome had been standing on the edge of a precipice, unaware that its fall had already begun. In the late 3rd century CE, The Roman Empire was teetering on the brink. Once a unified colossus, the empire was now fractured, an empire struggling to maintain its grip on the vast territories it had once controlled effortlessly. Attacks from barbarian tribes were escalating, the economy was in freefall, and internal corruption had reached a breaking point. Rome was slowly choking on its own size, its bureaucracy bloated and inefficient, and its military stretched thin. The weight of managing a world-spanning empire had grown unbearable. Enter Emperor Diocletian, a man who, though born of humble origins, would come to hold the fate of the empire in his hands. Faced with these overwhelming crises, Diocletian made a fateful decision: to divide the Roman Empire into two halves, East and West. This move, which he hoped would make the empire more manageable, would go on to change the course of history forever. To many, Diocletian's decision seemed like a pragmatic response to Rome's crumbling structure. The empire was simply too vast to control as one unit. There were too many threats on too many borders, too many disputes within the Senate, too many pockets of corruption. By splitting the empire, Diocletian believed that he could create two stronger, more nimble entities, each with its own emperor, while still maintaining overarching control. The Western Empire, based in Rome, and the Eastern Empire, with its new capital in Nicomedia, later moved to Constantinople, would govern independently but under the same overarching imperial authority. Diocletian took the title of Augustus for the East, while a co-emperor, the Western Augustus, would rule the other half. The problem? It wasn't just a division of land, it was a division of power. What Diocletian didn't anticipate was how the very act of splitting the empire would plant the seeds of rivalry and instability. By splitting the empire, he set in motion a dangerous power struggle that would destabilize Rome for centuries. The once unified empire, which had prided itself on its centralized authority, was now a house divided. The Eastern Empire, under Diocletian's rule, was wealthy and strategically positioned to thrive. Rich in trade, culture, and military prowess, the East was able to adapt, evolve, and maintain its strength. However, the Western Empire, with Rome at its heart, found itself in a much weaker position. It was isolated from many of the resources that had once been its lifeblood, and its once great military was beginning to fray. The East, with its access to the riches of the Silk Road, saw an economic boom while the West struggled to pay its soldiers and defend its borders. The tension between East and West was immediate. Though Diocletian tried to maintain the illusion of unity by placing co-emperors in each region, the reality was far more chaotic. The Western Empire, unable to keep pace with the East's prosperity, became a burden, a land of mismanagement, constant warfare, and growing dissent. Rivalries between the two empires grew, with each side eyeing the other, seeing opportunity in the other's misfortunes. As the West floundered, it increasingly became dependent on foreign mercenaries and unstable alliances, often with the very tribes that threatened its borders. Meanwhile, the East looked on with growing resentment, unwilling to risk its own resources to help the West. Diocletian's decision had consequences that went far beyond the political sphere. The cultural divide between East and West deepened. The Eastern Empire, later known as Byzantium, became a melting pot of Greek culture, Christian thought, and Eastern influences. In contrast, the West continued to cling to Roman traditions, but was slowly slipping into decay. The West could no longer afford the architectural wonders or the great public spectacles that had once defined Roman greatness. Roman identity began to shift, with the East becoming the intellectual and economic hub, while the West was slowly abandoned to its fate. And as the years passed, the once stable relationship between the two halves of the empire began to deteriorate into open competition. Power struggles between successive emperors, some of whom tried to reunite the empire, and others who sought to solidify their own regional dominance, created a volatile political landscape. Each new ruler was seen not as the protector of a united empire, but as the ruler of a divided and fractured kingdom. The notion of a single Roman identity started to fade. The West grew desperate, and the East, once Rome's greatest ally, now eyed it with disdain. By the time Diocletian retired in 305 CE, the empire's division was no longer a strategy, it was a reality. The West was crumbling, plagued by constant invasions from barbarian tribes and internal discord. Meanwhile, the East, despite its wealth and relative stability, could not escape the ripple effects of its neighbor's downfall. The idea of a unified Roman Empire had become an illusion. But there was a twist that no one could have predicted. The seeds of Rome's future were sown not in Rome itself, but in the eastern capital, Constantinople. It would be there, centuries later, that the last embers of the Roman flame would burn, until that, too, would finally be extinguished. But for now, in the divided world of the Roman Empire, the question remained, had Diocletian's gamble doomed Rome to fall forever? Or was the division merely a symptom of a much deeper rot within? By the early 4th century CE, the Roman Empire was increasingly a shadow of its former self. What had once been a well-oiled machine of military conquest, prosperity, and cultural unity was now crippled by rampant corruption, political infighting, and financial ruin. The emperors, once revered as gods, now struggled to hold their crumbling empire together. The cracks that had been steadily widening since Diocletian's division were now yawning chasms, and the question was no longer whether Rome would survive. It was how long it could survive, and at what cost. The empire, now split between the eastern and western halves, faced mounting pressure from all sides. Barbarians were pushing at the borders, internal revolts were on the rise, and the economy, once rich with the spoils of conquest and the flow of trade, had ground to a halt. Rome's once glorious military, the very backbone of its power, had become bloated and undisciplined. The imperial treasury, drained by years of extravagant spending, could no longer keep up with the demands of both the military and the lavish lifestyles of the elite. But the greatest problem lay with the men who ruled. Emperors, once seen as paragons of virtue and wisdom, were increasingly viewed as selfish and corrupt. The power struggle within the Roman court became a deadly game, where loyalty meant little, and the pursuit of wealth and power meant everything. As the empire's financial situation worsened, emperors turned to drastic measures. Heavy taxes were levied on the poor, and the elite were allowed to maintain their opulent lifestyles at the expense of those who had once supported them. The once glorious Roman roads, which had connected the farthest reaches of the empire, were now in disrepair, while new building projects were delayed or abandoned altogether. Meanwhile, the emperors of the West, with their dwindling resources, began to rely more and more on mercenaries, soldiers who fought not out of loyalty to Rome but for a paycheck. These mercenaries, many of whom were once Roman soldiers themselves, became disillusioned with the empire. They fought for Rome because they had once believed in its cause, but as the empire's coffers ran dry, they were increasingly left to fend for themselves. Their pay was often delayed, and they were given little in return for the bloody battles they fought on the empire's behalf. The emperor's promises became empty, their loyalty waned, and soon, many of these mercenaries began to question why they should fight for an empire that seemed to care little for their welfare. Rome's military, once the pride of the empire, had become a Frankenstein's monster, an army of hired hands, held together by nothing more than a paycheck and the promise of loot. These soldiers, now free of any deep loyalty to the Roman cause, turned against the empire that had once been their home. If an emperor was weak or corrupt, they would not hesitate to abandon him, or worse, join the ranks of those who sought to overthrow him. The corruption that permeated the political system had reached a fever pitch. Emperors, desperate to hold on to power, often turned a blind eye to the law and ruled with an iron fist. Political intrigue ran rampant, as ambitious generals, greedy senators, and unscrupulous officials jockeyed for position. Conspiracy and betrayal were common. Generals, once loyal to the empire, began to see themselves as potential rulers in their own right. The loyalty that had once bound the soldiers to their commanders had been replaced by a dangerous hunger for power. And then there were the emperors themselves, whose decisions, driven by greed, insecurity, and ego, only worsened the empire's problems. Emperors like Honorius, who would later face the ultimate collapse of the West, were faced with a deepening crisis. They were forced to make difficult decisions, decisions that often put short-term gains over long-term stability. The emperor's focus shifted from the welfare of the empire to the preservation of his own power. This toxic dynamic fueled a vicious cycle of failed policies, internal rebellions, and growing mistrust between the emperor and his people. Even when good emperors, such as the wise Theodosius I, attempted to restore order, the damage caused by decades of corrupt rule was far too deep. Laws were rarely enforced, the Senate had lost much of its power, and the imperial court was nothing more than a den of vipers, where power, influence, and wealth were traded like commodities. At the heart of it all was a system that no longer served the people or even the empire itself. It only served those in power. The term barbarian is often used to describe the various tribes that eventually overran the Roman Empire. But in truth, these barbarians were far more complicated than history has painted them. They were not the wild, bloodthirsty savages of popular myth, but were once allies, mercenaries, and even former Roman soldiers, people who had once fought alongside Rome. Their story is not one of mindless aggression, but of betrayal, disillusionment, and a brutal shift in loyalties that exposed the fragility of the Roman Empire from within. As the Western Roman Empire entered the 4th and 5th centuries, it found itself in a position it had never anticipated, under siege not only from without, but from former allies within. The empire had long relied on a delicate balance of alliances with various barbarian tribes. These tribes, including the Visigoths, Vandals, and Huns, had been used by Rome as mercenaries and even incorporated into the Roman military system. Some of these tribes had fought with the Romans in previous campaigns, serving as auxiliary troops, and in return, they were granted land, riches, or even Roman citizenship. But as the empire weakened, these once loyal allies began to feel the sting of neglect. The Roman Empire, facing economic collapse and internal strife, could no longer afford to honor its promises. The mercenaries, many of whom were veterans of the Roman legions themselves, found their pay delayed or reduced. Roman leaders, wrapped up in their own political and financial schemes, turned a blind eye to the desperate situation of the very soldiers who had once fought in Rome's name. The loyalty of these barbarian soldiers, once steadfast and dependable, began to erode. The story of the Visigoths, led by their king Aldrete, is a prime example of this betrayal. The Visigoths had long been allies of Rome, even serving as soldiers in the Roman legions. But when the empire could no longer keep its promises, when food was scarce and pay was withheld, the Visigoths began to question their allegiance. Alaric, who had once dreamed of serving under the imperial banner, soon turned his sights on the empire itself. After years of frustration, broken promises, and a growing sense of betrayal, Alaric led his people in an uprising that would forever change the course of history. The Visigoths were not the only tribe to feel this growing resentment. The Vandals, too, had been drawn into the orbit of the Roman Empire, serving as allies in various campaigns. Yet when the empire faltered, so did the trust that had bound these tribes to Rome. The Vandals, under their king Genseric, would eventually cross the Roman Empire's borders, and in 455 CE, they would sack Rome itself, stealing treasures and setting fire to the city. But it wasn't just these once loyal tribes that posed a threat. It was the sheer number of barbarian groups pushing into Roman territory. The Huns, led by the infamous Attila, were the final blow to Rome's frontiers. Though initially viewed by the Romans as little more than a distant threat, the Huns would prove to be the catalyst for a series of devastating invasions. With their terrifying cavalry and ruthless tactics, the Huns decimated the Eastern and Western empires alike, forcing tribes like the Visigoths to flee into Roman territory, desperate for refuge and a place to settle. As the Western Roman Empire's military and political structure disintegrated, these barbarians, who had once been allies, became enemies. The line between friend and foe became increasingly blurred. The Huns and other barbarian groups pushed deeper into Roman lands, not just in search of plunder, but because they too had been displaced by their own enemies, particularly the Huns. For the first time, it became clear that the barbarian tribes were no longer merely external threats. They were products of Rome's own failure, the unintended consequence of a once glorious empire that could no longer hold the world together. Ironically, some of these so-called barbarians were not so different from the Romans themselves. The Visigoths, for instance, had adopted many aspects of Roman culture. They wore Roman clothing, followed Roman laws, and even spoke Latin. Alaric's frustration was not with Roman civilization, it was with the empire's broken promises, its inability to honor the treaties and agreements that had once held the empire and the tribes together. His resentment was not a simple desire for destruction, but a desire for recognition, a recognition that the Roman Empire, in all its greatness, had failed to uphold its side of the bargain. As the Roman Empire crumbled, these tribes seized their opportunity. The Vandals, Visigoths, and others carved up the western half of the empire, establishing their own kingdoms on the land that had once been Roman. And while the Eastern Empire, or Byzantium, continued to survive, the fall of the West signaled the death of Roman dominance in the West. But it's essential to remember that these tribes didn't just destroy the empire, they replaced it. What followed was not the end of Rome's legacy, but its transformation. The kingdoms established by the barbarians would eventually form the foundation of medieval Europe, blending Roman governance with barbarian traditions, creating a new world in the ashes of the old. The fall of Rome, then, was not the simple invasion of foreign savages. It was the result of decades of betrayal, broken promises, and disillusionment. The so-called barbarians were not the mindless invaders history often portrays them as. They were once part of the very empire that fell, and their rise was the empire's own undoing. They were the bitter fruit of Rome's internal decay, a force that Rome itself had nurtured, and now, at the empire's weakest moment, it was reaped. By the early 5th century CE, the Western Roman Empire was hanging by a thread. The economic strain, social unrest, and increasing barbarian invasions had already begun to unravel the fabric of Roman society. In the midst of this chaos, the empire's fate would rest upon the decisions of one man, Emperor Honorius, who took the throne in 395 CE. His reign would mark one of the most tragic episodes in Roman history, where the empire's final hope for survival was sabotaged by one fatal flaw: hubris. Honorius, like many emperors before him, inherited an empire in decline. At just 10 years old when he ascended the throne, his regency was dominated by powerful figures who sought to control Rome through him. However, Honorius quickly grew into his role as emperor. Despite his age and inexperience, his rise to power would soon be defined not by grand victories or bold reforms, but by a string of poor decisions.
Driven by pride, short-sightedness, and an overwhelming desire to maintain control at any cost. The fatal flaw at the heart of Honorius's reign was his inability to recognize the gravity of the situation. Surrounded by advisors who flattered him but failed to provide sound counsel, he stubbornly clung to the belief that he could salvage the empire without understanding the scope of its disintegration. Aware of the chaos within his borders and the growing pressure from barbarian forces, Honorius often refused to make necessary decisions. His hesitations were compounded by his vanity and a need to appear strong in the face of adversity. One of the most egregious mistakes of Honorius's reign was his failure to properly respond to the Visigoths, led by King Alaric, who had begun their devastating march through the empire. The Visigoths had long been in Rome's employ, serving as mercenaries, but as the empire weakened, Alaric grew increasingly disillusioned. His requests for land and payment were repeatedly denied, and he, like so many others, felt betrayed by the empire he had once served. Alaric's demand for recognition was ignored, and the trust between Rome and the Visigoths disintegrated. When Alaric and his Visigoths began to lay siege to Rome in 408 CE, Honorius's response was slow, disorganized, and characterized by an absence of clear leadership. The emperor, from the safety of his court in Ravenna, saw the situation as a mere military threat, an obstacle to be dealt with in time. But time was not on his side. Alaric, enraged by the lack of respect from Rome, tightened his grip on the city, starving its people and forcing them to the brink of collapse. Despite the threat to Rome itself, Honorius remained detached, preoccupied with his own image, and distracted by courtly intrigues. His court at Ravenna was rife with corruption and infighting, with various factions vying for control. Rather than unify the empire's defenses, he focused on maintaining his grip on power, prioritizing political maneuvering over military strategy. His ego, combined with a lack of decisiveness, left the empire open to catastrophic failure. Alaric's siege of Rome became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the Western Empire. As starvation set in and tensions reached a boiling point, Honorius finally agreed to negotiate with Alaric, but his terms were insincere. Instead of a real settlement, Honorius offered a humiliatingly small sum of gold in exchange for peace, an insult that only inflamed Alaric's rage. It was too little, too late. By the time the negotiations broke down, the Visigoths had already breached Rome's gates, and in 410 CE, the unthinkable happened. Rome was sacked for the first time in over 800 years. The sack of Rome was not just a military defeat, it was a psychological blow to the Roman world. Rome, the eternal city, had long been thought of as invincible, a symbol of divine protection and eternal power. For the barbarians, sacking Rome was more than just an act of conquest. It was an act of vengeance, a symbolic victory against an empire that had betrayed and used them. For the Roman people, it was the first sign that the empire was beyond saving, that the dream of a unified Roman world was over. Yet even after the sack of Rome, Honorius failed to confront the deeper issues facing the empire. His leadership remained passive, with no decisive action taken to address the root causes of the collapse. He continued to surround himself with sycophants and advisors who told him what he wanted to hear, rather than what needed to be done. Rome, despite its near destruction, was still under siege from multiple fronts. Barbarian tribes continued to push into Roman territory, and the imperial treasury was drained. But Honorius remained indifferent, incapable of recognizing that his failure to act had condemned the empire to its final decline. The final blow came in 476 CE, when the last Roman emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, was forced to abdicate in the face of increasing pressure from the barbarian general Odoacer. The event, which marked the official end of the Western Roman Empire, was as anticlimactic as the rest of the empire's fall. Romulus Augustulus was a mere puppet in the hands of powerful military leaders, and his reign ended not with a battle, but with a quiet abdication, another stark symbol of Rome's diminished power. The fate of the Western Empire had been sealed long before the last emperor's abdication by the weak, misguided decisions of leaders like Honorius, whose failure to lead had already doomed it. Yet the damage was not limited to the Western Empire alone. Honorius's failure to provide strong leadership had consequences that rippled throughout the empire. His inability to secure meaningful alliances, confront internal corruption, and address the growing barbarian threat left a legacy of instability that would continue to haunt the Roman world long after the fall of the West. Even the Eastern Empire, though it would survive for several more centuries, would never fully recover from the damage caused by the neglect of Rome's western half. In the end, Honorius's reign was a tragic example of how a leader's personal flaws, pride, ego, and indecisiveness can destroy an empire. His downfall was not caused by external forces alone, but by his inability to see and respond to the growing internal rot. The fatal flaw of Rome's last emperors was not a single moment of failure, but a continuous pattern of neglect and mismanagement that culminated in the ultimate destruction of the empire. The sack of Rome in 410 CE was a moment so earth-shattering that it became a symbol of the end of an era. For over 800 years, Rome had stood as the heart of the Roman Empire, invincible in its grandeur and seemingly protected by the favor of the gods. But in the early 5th century, the unthinkable happened. The Eternal City was ravaged by an army of Visigoths, led by King Alaric, once an ally of Rome, now turned bitter enemy. Alaric's story is not that of a mindless invader seeking to destroy Rome for the sake of conquest. He had once been a part of the Roman military machine, a soldier who had served in the Roman army and even fought under Roman banners. His rise to power had been deeply intertwined with the empire's internal politics, and at one time, he had believed that Rome and its leaders were trustworthy allies. But over the years, as the empire weakened, Alaric's loyalty had eroded. Betrayed by Rome's empty promises and mistreatment of his people, he turned against the empire, setting his sights on Rome itself. The betrayal began not on the battlefield, but within the halls of Roman power. Alaric, a leader of the Visigoths, had first come to the Romans with a request. The Visigoths, once a proud and powerful tribe, had been pushed by other barbarian groups, including the Huns, into Roman territory. Seeking refuge, they made a deal with the empire. In exchange for their loyalty, they asked for land to settle and for a guarantee of protection. The Romans agreed, but as time went on, they failed to honor their side of the bargain. As the Western Roman Empire weakened under the leadership of Emperor Honorius, who refused to deliver on promises made to Alaric, the Visigoths found themselves in an increasingly precarious position. Their supplies were dwindling, their warriors were growing restless, and their trust in the empire was all but gone. In desperation, Alaric began demanding what had been promised to him: land, wealth, and a seat at the table of Roman power. But the Roman court, preoccupied with internal strife, ignored his pleas, considering him nothing more than a nuisance. The Visigoths had served Rome for years, fighting in its armies and defending its borders. But as Alaric's frustration grew, so too did his sense of betrayal. The treatment of his people, the broken promises, and the growing instability of the empire made it clear to him that the Romans had no intention of honoring their agreements. He was no longer willing to stand by the empire that had used him and his people for its own ends. The tide had turned, and the Visigoths now sought revenge. In 408 CE, Alaric laid siege to the city of Rome for the first time. However, despite the growing pressure on the city, the empire failed to act decisively. Emperor Honorius, ensconced in his distant court at Ravenna, could not fathom the gravity of the threat facing his capital. The siege dragged on for years, with neither side willing to give an inch. In the meantime, the Visigoths pushed deeper into the Roman territories, burning and pillaging as they went. Finally, in 410 CE, Alaric's patience reached its breaking point. The siege of Rome had lasted long enough. His demands had been ignored for too long. This was no longer just a military campaign. It was personal. Alaric wanted vengeance, and he was willing to do whatever it took to extract it. He had once been a trusted ally of the Roman Empire, but now he was Rome's greatest enemy. On August 24th, 410 CE, the unthinkable happened. The Visigoths, after years of sieging the city, finally broke through the walls of Rome. The gates of the Eternal City were wide open, and the Visigoths poured in. They did not simply storm the city, they sacked it. The great temples, the grand palaces, and the storied treasures of Rome were stripped bare. The city was plundered, and its inhabitants were left to face the terrifying consequences of their empire's betrayal. Rome's fall was not a swift, glorious battle, but a painful, drawn-out unraveling. The Visigoths, although fierce in their assault, showed restraint in some areas. Alaric, ever mindful of the symbolic power of the city, ordered that the churches be spared, a remarkable act of mercy. But even so, the destruction was immense. The treasures of the empire, the gold, the silver, and the priceless works of art, were looted and taken away, never to be returned. The city's once proud monuments, including the Palatine Hill and the temples of the gods, were set on fire, their ruins serving as a testament to the disintegration of Roman power. For the citizens of Rome, the shock of the sack was incomprehensible. They had lived for centuries with the belief that their city was eternal, that it would never fall. The empire's once indomitable military and political might had crumbled, and now the very heart of the empire lay in ruins. The psychological impact of this event was immense, not just for the people of Rome, but for the world. It shattered the myth of Roman invincibility and marked the end of an era. For centuries, Rome had been the shining beacon of civilization, a symbol of eternal power. But in the span of just a few days, the unthinkable had occurred. The city had been sacked, and its grandeur had been reduced to ashes. However, the true betrayal of this event was not just in the plunder and destruction of Rome. It was in the fact that Alaric and his Visigoths were once allies, once part of the Roman military apparatus. Their attack on Rome was not the act of a foreign enemy, but of a disillusioned partner who had been repeatedly betrayed by the very empire he had once served. Rome's failure to uphold its promises, its inability to maintain its alliances, and its internal strife had led to this moment of devastating retribution. The sack of Rome was a turning point, not just in the history of the empire, but in the consciousness of the Roman world. It marked the beginning of the end for the Western Roman Empire, while the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, would continue for several more centuries. The fall of Rome's capital signaled that the empire in the West was beyond saving. The Visigoths, once loyal mercenaries, had become the very force that would destroy Rome. Rome had been betrayed from within by its leaders, its failures, and its inability to recognize the rising threats at its borders. The final betrayal, the one that led to Rome's first sack, came not from some barbaric enemy, but from those who had once been its closest allies. And in this betrayal, the once immortal empire found itself irrevocably fractured, its glory reduced to a mere shadow of what it had been. By 476 CE, the Western Roman Empire was a shell of its former self. The once mighty empire, which had stretched across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, was now fractured and weak. Its once legendary legions were made up of mercenaries with divided loyalties. Its economy was in shambles, and its leaders, often powerless pawns in the hands of military commanders, had long since lost the ability to defend the empire's borders. And at the very heart of this crumbling empire was a figure whose reign symbolized the complete disintegration of Rome's power and influence. Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire. Romulus Augustulus was no military hero, nor was he a great statesman. He was, in fact, a puppet placed on the throne by his father, Orestes, a military general who had orchestrated his rise to power. The young emperor was barely in his teens when he was crowned in 475 CE, an emperor in name only, with little authority over the actual running of the empire. The true power behind the throne was his father, who had seized control of the imperial office through a coup. But this power struggle was only the surface of a much deeper crisis that was eating away at the empire from within. Romulus Augustulus's reign was a brief and tragic one, lasting little more than a year. His time on the throne was not marked by any great military campaigns or political victories. Instead, his rule was a time of desperation, as the Western Roman Empire continued to spiral into chaos. For Romulus, the empire was already beyond saving, and his very position as emperor was little more than a symbol of its inevitable collapse. The true force behind the fall of the empire in the West was not Romulus himself, but the powerful military leaders who controlled the fate of the empire. By 476 CE, the Roman legions were filled with barbarian mercenaries, many of whom were no longer loyal to the empire that had once paid their wages. Among these mercenaries was Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain who had been serving as a general in the Roman army. Odoacer's growing power would become the final nail in the coffin for the Western Roman Empire. Odoacer's rise was a direct result of the weakening power of Rome's imperial rulers. In the years leading up to 476 CE, the Western Roman Empire had been governed by a series of weak emperors who had little control over the military or the empire's vast territory. Orestes, Romulus's father, had sought to retain his hold on power by appeasing the growing strength of the barbarian factions within the empire. However, his attempts to placate these forces were ultimately futile. Odoacer, once a loyal soldier under Orestes, had other ambitions. In 476 CE, Odoacer made his move. He and his troops marched on Ravenna, the capital of the Western Roman Empire, and seized control of the imperial palace. Romulus Augustulus, the young emperor, was powerless to stop them. He had no military backing and no real authority. Odoacer, recognizing the symbolic nature of the emperor's position, made the fateful decision to remove Romulus from the throne. Rather than overthrowing the boy emperor with force, he offered him a quiet abdication. Romulus was forced to give up the purple robes of emperorship and retire to a life of obscurity, granted a small pension by his conqueror. Romulus Augustulus's abdication marked the end of the Western Roman Empire, not with a grand battle, but with a whimper. The last emperor of the West was not slain in combat, nor was he exiled in disgrace. Instead, he was simply removed from the throne and sent into retirement. Odoacer, in a move that shocked the Roman world, declared himself king of Italy, but he refrained from taking the title of emperor. This marked a new era, not of Roman rule, but of a barbarian kingdom that would control the heart of the former empire. The Western Roman Empire, as a political entity, ceased to exist on that day in 476 CE. What's often overlooked in the story of Romulus Augustulus's fall is the complex web of political maneuvering, betrayals, and shifting loyalties that led to this final moment. Odoacer's rise was the result of a deepening divide between the barbarian factions and the traditional Roman aristocracy. The once great empire had been bled dry by decades of infighting, corruption, and military overreach. The legions that had once kept the empire secure had now turned against it, fighting for their own interests rather than the interests of Rome. In this environment, the idea of a Roman emperor had become meaningless. Romulus Augustulus himself was nothing more than a pawn in this game of power. The decision to install him as emperor was an attempt by his father, Orestes, to stabilize the empire, but it was an ill-fated one. Orestes's political calculations ultimately led to his own downfall. He was assassinated by his own soldiers in the wake of Odoacer's coup, a brutal reminder that loyalty in the empire had become fragile and unreliable. With Orestes gone, Romulus was left without any support or political power, a mere figurehead in a dying empire. Romulus's abdication was not just a loss of power for one man. It was the loss of an entire civilization. The Western Roman Empire had been the center of the ancient world, a beacon of culture, military might, and political organization. By 476 CE, however, that beacon had long since dimmed. The empire had been hollowed out from the inside, and its collapse was not the result of a single catastrophic event, but of centuries of neglect, mismanagement, and internal strife. Romulus Augustulus's fall was the final chapter in a long story of decline. However, despite the symbolic end of the Western Roman Empire, the legacy of Rome did not vanish entirely. The Eastern Roman Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire, would continue to thrive for nearly 1,000 more years. But in the West, Rome's once mighty walls had crumbled, and its power was now in the hands of foreign rulers. Odoacer's kingdom in Italy marked the beginning of a new era in Europe, one that would see the rise of barbarian kingdoms and the eventual formation of medieval Europe. Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, lived out the remainder of his life in obscurity. He had been deposed by a barbarian general, but the true tragedy of his reign was not in his downfall. It was in what his reign symbolized. His removal from the throne marked the end of an empire that had once seemed immortal, but had been brought down by its own internal weaknesses. The fate of Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor of the West, was not a grand tragedy of battle or bloodshed, but a quiet end to a civilization that had lost its way. When Romulus Augustulus was deposed in 476 CE, the Western Roman Empire officially ceased to exist, but the Roman legacy did not die with it. While Europe descended into chaos with the rise of barbarian kingdoms in the West, the Eastern Roman Empire, centered around the city of Constantinople, held on. It would continue to carry the banner of Rome for nearly 1,000 years after the fall of the West, but it wasn't the glorious continuation that many hoped for. In fact, the Byzantine Empire, so called by historians centuries later, was itself struggling with its own dangerous cracks, internal betrayals, and the weight of an increasingly fractured world. The fall of the Western Empire may have felt like the ultimate collapse, but the East was far from immune to the same issues that had brought down its sibling empire. The Eastern Roman Empire, once seen as a stronghold of Roman continuity, was undergoing its own series of internal struggles, political shifts, and military challenges that threatened its very survival. In the wake of the fall of the West, Constantinople, under Emperor Zeno, found itself balancing precariously between its Roman past and a future filled with uncertainty. The city was thriving, still an intellectual and economic powerhouse, but the political leadership was fractured. The Eastern Empire had experienced its own series of weak rulers, revolts, and military defeats, leaving the empire divided in loyalty and plagued by shifting power dynamics. For the Eastern Roman Empire, survival became the name of the game. The idea of restoring the full glory of the Roman Empire was a distant dream for the Eastern emperors. The empire's leadership knew that they could never recreate the vast power of the Western Roman Empire, nor could they even dream of reclaiming the territories that had once made Rome the undisputed master of the Mediterranean. Instead, the empire's leaders focused on maintaining what they had left: its wealth, its strategic position, and its vital alliances. Emperor Zeno, whose reign began shortly after the fall of the West, faced challenges both from within and from without. On the one hand, he had to deal with the growing influence of powerful military commanders, many of whom were loyal to the barbarian factions or had more personal ambitions than loyalty to the emperor. On the other, the eastern borders were under constant threat from the rising power of the Huns to the north and the Goths to the west. Zeno had to navigate these turbulent waters carefully, making concessions to barbarians and trying to consolidate his own power. The most notable of Zeno's moves was the creation of a military alliance with Theodoric the Great, a leader of the Ostrogoths, in the hopes of using him as a weapon against the rising power of Odoacer in Italy, who had crowned himself king of Italy after deposing Romulus Augustulus. The Eastern Empire's strategy was to pit one barbarian faction against another, playing the forces of the West against each other. It was a game of manipulation, and Zeno was no stranger to it, but it was a strategy born of desperation. The days of Roman glory were over, and all that remained was a struggle for survival. One of the key themes in the aftermath of Rome's fall was the loss of loyalty within the military ranks. While the Western Roman Empire had been weakened by the breakdown of its military discipline, the Eastern Empire struggled with similar issues. The most immediate threat was the increasing dominance of mercenaries, soldiers who fought not for Roman ideals, but for pay. These mercenaries were often made up of various barbarian groups who had once been allies or enemies, but were now a crucial part of the Byzantine military apparatus. Many were Goths, Huns, and Slavs, and their loyalty was always in question. In the years following the fall of the Western Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire's military forces, relying more and more on these foreign mercenaries, found themselves caught in a vicious cycle. The emperors of the East had no true military strength of their own and were forced to rely on the very tribes that had once been considered the enemies of Rome. But loyalty among these mercenaries was fickle. Many of the soldiers were more interested in plundering, fighting for the highest bidder, or carving out their own territories than in maintaining any sense of allegiance to the emperor or the Roman state. This led to revolts, conspiracies, and a series of military coups within the Eastern Empire. The most infamous of these revolts was the rise of the Isaurians, a group of soldiers from the Anatolian region who rose up against the Eastern Empire's leadership. Their leader, the Isaurian general Zeno, took advantage of the chaos within the empire, rising to power through assassination, manipulation, and bribery. His reign would become notorious for its brutality and political intrigue, as he struggled to maintain control over a divided and disillusioned military. But Zeno's reign also signaled the shift from an empire dominated by traditional Roman elites to one controlled by military strongmen, where the emperors were little more than pawns in the hands of their soldiers. The Eastern Roman Empire's long struggle for survival after the fall of the West also led to a crisis of identity. As the centuries passed, the empire began to drift further and further from its Roman roots. The term Byzantine Empire would not even come into use until much later in history. The people of the empire still saw themselves as Romans, but their empire had evolved beyond anything that could have been imagined in the time of Augustus or Constantine. The cities of the East, such as Constantinople, were no longer Roman in the sense that they had once been. While the grandeur and cultural achievements of the ancient Romans had left a lasting legacy, the Eastern Empire began to adopt a distinctly Greek influence. This shift was not just cultural, but also ideological. The Eastern Roman Empire became more focused on Christianity, which had taken on a dominant role in shaping the empire's politics and social structure. Christianity, which had once been an underground religion in the Roman Empire, now held unparalleled influence in the East. The emperors themselves were seen not only as rulers, but as divinely appointed figures, charged with defending both the Christian faith and the empire itself. However, as the empire moved further into its Christian identity, the Eastern Roman state also began to face internal theological conflicts, particularly the rise of various heresies. These disputes often led to schisms, violent uprisings, and instability within the empire. Theological debate became so entangled with politics that it often appeared as though the survival of the empire itself was at stake. Though the Eastern Roman Empire managed to survive the fall of its Western counterpart, it was embroiled in continuous warfare for centuries. On one hand, there were the external threats from the Huns, Slavs, and Arabs who pushed on its borders and constantly threatened Constantinople. But just as damaging were the internal conflicts that splintered the empire. The Byzantine Empire was never a unified whole. Instead, it was a collection of different regions, ethnic groups, and rival factions that often fought each other as much as they fought their external enemies. Despite its internal struggles, the Byzantine Empire remained a force to be reckoned with in the Mediterranean world. However, this came at a cost. The empire's resources were drained by constant military campaigns, and its political structure became more and more corrupt. As a result, while the Byzantine Empire endured, it did so by constantly adapting to the challenges of a changing world. The empire had not returned to its former glory. It was surviving, but barely. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE was not the end of the Roman world, but it marked the beginning of a new chapter for the Eastern Roman Empire. By the time of Emperor Justinian I, who ascended to the throne in 527 CE, the Byzantine Empire had endured over 50 years of internal strife and external threats. Justinian, often hailed as the last great Roman emperor, sought to revive the Roman Empire's former glory by reclaiming lost territories and solidifying the empire's dominance over the Mediterranean world. However, beneath the glittering facade of ambition, wealth, and military triumph lay the seeds of the empire's eventual decline. Justinian's reign was marked by grand visions of restoration and imperial greatness. He dreamed of reuniting the entire Roman Empire, both East and West, under his rule, and he pursued this goal with relentless energy. He launched a series of military campaigns aimed at reclaiming the former Western territories, including North Africa, Italy, and parts of Spain. His general Belisarius was instrumental in these campaigns, successfully recapturing much of North Africa from the Vandals and defeating the Ostrogoths in Italy. For a time, it seemed that Justinian was succeeding in his goal of restoring the Roman Empire to its former territorial extent. But Justinian's ambitions were fraught with peril. While his military successes in the early years of his reign were celebrated, they came at a great cost. The Byzantine Empire, though vast, was never as powerful or wealthy as the ancient Roman Empire had been. The empire's resources were stretched thin by the constant warfare, and the campaigns to reclaim the West drained the treasury. By the time Justinian had achieved his territorial ambitions, the empire was burdened by enormous debts, and the cost of maintaining these far-flung conquests was becoming unsustainable. Moreover, the territories Justinian had reclaimed were not as easily controlled as he had hoped. In North Africa, the Byzantine Empire faced resistance from the local Berber tribes, who had long been hostile to Roman rule. In Italy, the Goths had already established a strong presence, and the region was plagued by internal divisions and instability. Justinian's attempts to consolidate power in these regions were thwarted by rebellious local elites, who had little loyalty to Constantinople. What Justinian had gained through war, he struggled to hold on to through political maneuvering and diplomacy. As the empire's military resources were stretched to their limits, disaster struck in the form of the Plague of Justinian, a catastrophic outbreak of the bubonic plague that struck the empire in 541 CE. The plague decimated the population of Constantinople, and its effects were felt throughout the Mediterranean world. The disease killed perhaps as many as 25 to 50 million people over several waves, devastating the empire's military, economic, and social fabric. The plague left Justinian with fewer soldiers to defend his conquests, fewer workers to maintain the empire's infrastructure, and fewer citizens to pay taxes. The plague revealed just how fragile the Byzantine Empire had become. What had once seemed like a powerful, invincible empire was now teetering on the edge of collapse. Justinian's grand ambitions, built on the idea of reviving the Roman Empire, were suddenly shattered by the harsh reality of disease, economic decline, and political instability. His military campaigns, though initially successful, had left the empire overextended and vulnerable. The empire was unable to sustain the vast territories it had reclaimed, and the borders that Justinian had so diligently fought to restore began to unravel. But Justinian's reign was not only marked by military and political failures, it was also defined by internal divisions and contradictions. Despite his successes in restoring some semblance of Roman rule in the West, the empire was plagued by deep social and religious conflicts. The Nika riots of 532 CE, which broke out in Constantinople during Justinian's reign, were a violent expression of the divisions within the empire. The riots were fueled by tensions between rival political factions, as well as discontent with Justinian's heavy-handed rule. The unrest resulted in the deaths of thousands of people and forced Justinian to reconsider his approach to governance. One of the most significant issues that plagued the empire during Justinian's reign was religious division. The empire had long struggled with the tension between Orthodox Christianity and various heretical sects, but under Justinian, these divisions reached a fever pitch. Justinian sought to impose religious unity by force, attempting to suppress heretical beliefs such as monophysitism, the belief that Christ had only one divine nature, rather than both divine and human. His aggressive policies led to widespread persecution of religious minorities and sparked violent conflict between factions. In some regions of the empire, religious leaders were pitted against one another, exacerbating the empire's internal divisions. Despite Justinian's monumental efforts to restore the Roman Empire, the truth was that the Byzantine Empire was no longer the power it once had been. The empire's wealth, which had allowed for the construction of grand projects like the Hagia Sophia and the expansion of the imperial bureaucracy, was being rapidly depleted by constant warfare, civil unrest, and a stagnant economy. The Justinian Code, which Justinian famously codified, was a lasting achievement, but it was also a symbol of the empire's growing reliance on bureaucracy and legalism at the expense of real political and military power. The Eastern Roman Empire's military prowess was beginning to falter as the empire became more dependent on mercenaries and foreign soldiers. The Herulian mercenaries, who had once been the backbone of the imperial army, began to demand greater pay and started to shift their loyalties to rival factions. The Byzantine navy, once a formidable force, was weakened by a lack of funding and resources, and its territorial holdings became increasingly difficult to defend. The empire was slowly losing its grip on the Mediterranean world. On the diplomatic front, Justinian's expansionist policies had isolated many of his former allies. His aggression toward the Persian Sassanid Empire, while initially successful, eventually led to a long and costly war. The Persian Empire, once an ancient rival, had been significantly weakened by the years of conflict with Rome. But Justinian's insistence on fighting a protracted war drained Byzantine resources and diverted attention from other pressing issues. At the same time, the Islamic Caliphate began to rise in the early 7th century, threatening the very foundations of the Byzantine Empire. By the time Justinian's empire was at its height, it was already being encroached upon from every side by the tides of history that would soon overwhelm it. In the end, the grandeur of Justinian's reign, which seemed so promising at the start, was a fragile mirage, a brief moment of imperial glory in a much longer era of decline. Though Justinian's efforts were notable in many ways, they ultimately masked the empire's deeper structural weaknesses. Its inability to maintain its borders, its reliance on increasingly unstable mercenaries, and its declining economic base. The empire's greatest territorial expansion would be followed by centuries of attrition and loss. Justinian's vision of a revived Roman Empire was never realized, and instead, the Byzantine Empire entered a slow, painful decline. Despite its persistence, the empire's true fate was sealed by its inability to adapt to the changing world around it. The Byzantine Empire would continue to stagger on for centuries, but its eventual fall in 1453 was inevitable. Justinian's reign, with all its ambition and overreach, had merely postponed the inevitable collapse. The empire, once the epitome of Roman greatness, had become a shadow of its former self. Its glory a distant memory, its political system a fragile remnant, and its military a hollow shell of what it once was. The Byzantine Empire had endured for almost 1,000 years after the fall of its Western counterpart, holding on by sheer will, though its glory days were long behind it. From the time of Justinian I, the empire had been in a slow, inexorable decline, struggling with external invasions, internal strife, and ever-decreasing resources. By the 15th century, the once mighty empire had been reduced to a mere shadow of its former self, and its capital, Constantinople, was the last remaining vestige of the Roman world. But even Constantinople, the city of the world's desire, was no longer the impregnable fortress it once had been. In 1453, the end came in a moment of historical irony. The city that had once been the heart of the Roman Empire fell to the rising power of the Ottomans, a new and ruthless empire that had ascended to dominate the region. The fall of Constantinople was not just a political or military event. It was a moment that reshaped the world, marking the end of the medieval period and the beginning of the Renaissance, as the last remnants of ancient Rome were swept away. But the fall of Constantinople didn't happen overnight. It was the culmination of a series of tragic events, missed opportunities, and internal betrayals that had been slowly building for centuries. By the time of its fall, Constantinople had become a city desperately clinging to life, with its once impervious walls breached by centuries of war and neglect. The Ottoman forces under Sultan Mehmed II, known as the Conqueror, had been slowly tightening their grip on the city, and the Byzantine Empire was helpless to resist the impending assault. By the early 1450s, the Byzantine Empire was a mere shell of its former self, with its territory shrinking rapidly. The empire had lost much of its land to the Ottomans, and its population had dwindled to a fraction of its peak size. The last reigning emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, was a man who understood that the survival of his empire was a lost cause, but he was also deeply committed to defending the city for as long as he could. His leadership during the siege of Constantinople has been viewed with both admiration and tragic resignation. Constantine XI, though valiant and determined, faced insurmountable odds. The Byzantine Empire's military forces were no match for the vast Ottoman army that surrounded the city. Mehmed II's forces numbered in the tens of thousands, including elite janissaries, heavy artillery, and a fleet that had effectively blockaded the city's ports. The Byzantines, on the other hand, were severely outnumbered and underfunded, with only a few thousand defenders and little support from the outside world. The city's defense relied on the famous Theodosian walls, which had withstood numerous sieges over the centuries. But even these ancient fortifications were not enough to deter the Ottomans. Mehmed II employed an array of new tactics, including the use of massive cannons, which had never been seen before in warfare on such a scale. The Ottomans used these cannons to break through the city's walls, causing devastation and forcing the Byzantines into a position of extreme vulnerability. Despite the desperate pleas from the last Byzantine emperor for help, the Western powers that had once been allies to the Roman Empire were now either unwilling or unable to come to Constantinople's aid. Over the centuries, the relationships between the East and West had grown increasingly strained, particularly after the Great Schism of 1054, when the Christian Church split into the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church. This schism created deep divisions, and by the 15th century, the Catholic West had little desire to intervene in the struggles of the Eastern Church. In a final effort to save his empire, Constantine XI turned to the West for support, hoping for military aid. Pope Nicholas V, seeing the growing Ottoman threat, called for a crusade to save the city. However, the response was tepid at best. The papal legates arrived, but they could only offer limited support. The Venetians and Genoese, who had their own interests in the region, sent small contingents of troops and ships, but they were no match for the massive Ottoman siege. Furthermore, the Eastern Orthodox Church's refusal to reconcile with Rome made the Western powers hesitant to offer substantial assistance. The Eastern Orthodox Church, which had remained independent of the papacy for centuries, was a source of deep religious and political tension between the East and West. The inability of both sides to put aside their differences meant that Constantinople, though it was the last bastion of the Roman world, was essentially left to face its final moments alone. On May 29, 1453, after weeks of intense bombardment and resistance, the Ottoman forces finally breached the walls of Constantinople. The Byzantine defenders fought valiantly, but it was clear that the end had come. Constantine XI, refusing to abandon his city, died in battle, marking the final chapter of the Roman Empire. His body was never found, and the tale of his last moments became a legend, a poignant symbol of the end of an era. When the Ottomans finally broke into the city, they slaughtered thousands of its inhabitants, and Mehmed II's forces looted the city, destroying churches, homes, and monuments. The Hagia Sophia, the magnificent cathedral that had stood for nearly 1,000 years as the heart of Eastern Christianity, was converted into a mosque. The city, which had been the cultural and intellectual center of the ancient world, was now a possession of the Ottomans, who would rule it for the next 400 years. But even in the fall of Constantinople, there was a twist. The impact was not just military. The fall of the city set off a chain of events that would ripple across Europe. The Renaissance, already in full swing, would be profoundly affected by the loss of Constantinople. Scholars, artists, and intellectuals fled the city, bringing with them priceless manuscripts, ancient knowledge, and artistic traditions that would fuel the Renaissance in Italy and beyond. The Ottoman Empire's rise also changed the balance of power in the Mediterranean, heralding the dawn of a new era. As the city burned and the final remnants of the Byzantine Empire crumbled, there were whispers of betrayal within the empire itself. Some historians argue that there were factions within the Byzantine elite who, for their own reasons, were willing to make peace with the Ottomans in exchange for power. The Byzantine nobility, exhausted and divided by centuries of internal strife, had at times been willing to make concessions to the Ottomans in exchange for personal safety and political favors. There were also rumors of secret alliances between certain Byzantine officials and the Ottomans, though these allegations remain largely unproven. What is certain is that Constantinople's fall was not simply the result of military conquest. It was also a tragedy of missed opportunities, failed diplomacy, and deep internal division. The collapse of the Byzantine Empire was not inevitable, but it was shaped by centuries of decline, corruption, and the inability to adapt to a changing world. The once great Roman Empire had not been destroyed in a single day. It had unraveled over centuries, and in the end, it fell because of the failures of its leaders, its alliances, and its people. When Constantinople fell, the Roman Empire was finally undeniably gone, but its legacy did not vanish entirely. The Byzantine Empire, despite its faults and weaknesses, had preserved the ancient Roman traditions for over 1,000 years, and its influence would be felt for centuries to come. The fall of Constantinople was the death of an empire, but it was also the birth of a new world, one in which the legacy of Rome would live on in different forms, through the Catholic Church, through the Ottoman Empire, and through the rebirth of classical learning in the Renaissance. The fall of Constantinople remains one of history's most dramatic moments, a brutal, tragic end to a once great empire. Yet, like all great empires, its legacy was not simply erased with the fall of its capital. Rome, in some form, would continue to influence the world long after its political power had vanished.